little bit in, there we go, got it recording. Okay. So I've also dabbled a little bit in fitness as well. Some of you know me from Synergy Coach, so that's kind of where that comes into play. But what I want to talk about tonight is primarily food labels. I know I get a lot of questions about this when coaching clients, so I just kind of wanted to put it all out there in a format that's easy for everyone to kind of follow. And forgive me, this is the first time I've done a webinar in this format, so I'm still working out some of the technical difficulties. So just be patient with me for a minute. But that said, I welcome your all's feedback and any questions. You all should have the capability. There should be a chat option in the little lower left-hand corner, and then you can also just chime in. You're able to either put yourself on mute, or you can just, when you speak, the audio should automatically pick it up, so you can kind of have a dialogue that way. But if you don't want me to hear it, just mute your screen, and then that way you can kind of, if you're munching or you're kind of doing whatever, have background noise, that way the whole webinar won't necessarily hear that. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. So like I said, this is food labels. It's basically just kind of a one-on-one on what to look for in food labels and what different things mean and what they don't mean. There's a lot of confusion. Food companies somewhat intentionally make it that way. So it can be really confusing as a consumer to know what's fact, what's fiction. So I just kind of wanted to walk through that. And honestly, I just feel like the best way to do that is through a PowerPoint. I think it's a little easier for people to both hear me say it, but also see it in print. And then of course, as I mentioned, you all, now that I figured out how to record it, you all will get recordings of this as well. So you can kind of go back and look at the slides. If anyone wants the slides, I'm happy to email those as well. So my objectives for today, like I said, is to kind of understand what's regulated, what's not, understand different terms that are also put on food labels and kind of what they actually mean, and then understand, we'll go into a little bit of supplements. Supplements are a little bit different than food, and we'll kind of talk about why that is and how that is. But we'll kind of talk about how supplements are regulated in some ways and how they're not. So like I said, for those of you just now joining us, sit down, have a seat, get comfy. You all have the ability to interact with me either audibly, so I've turned your cameras off, but you can audibly reach out and ask questions, so just make sure you're not on mute. But if you want to ask a question, just go ahead and fire away. Or there's also a chat option. I believe it should be in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, so that is available to you as well. So we're just getting started, so don't worry. And then of course, as I mentioned, you all will get this recorded, so no worries there if you missed the first part. Most of it was just me introducing myself and fumbling a little bit with the technology. So first things first, what food labels are regulated? So there really are only two food labels that are regulated. One is a nutrition facts label, and the other is the ingredients list. So those are regulated by the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. That's a federal regulatory body that regulates food and drug, as the name would suggest. So that's anything that's considered a food item, and that's anything that's like a medication, whether that's a medication that's sold over the counter or a prescription medication. They're in charge of all of that. And the goal behind the nutrition facts label and the ingredients label, so the ingredients label is kind of a little bit more straightforward. It's just what ingredients are in this product. This comes into play often for processed foods, just because sometimes there are things in them that are not necessarily intuitive. Or sometimes you'll see things on there like the label that I have here on the right-hand side. It says that it contains wheat and soy, and then you can kind of see that the picture got cropped up a little bit, but you can see that it is also either made in a plant or on equipment that uses milk or eggs, which are other allergens. The main goal behind the ingredients list is to understand what's in the product, largely from an allergen standpoint. So if you are somebody who has a food allergy, you're able to quickly look at that label and understand whether or not that product contains the thing that you are allergic to, or the allergen. That's mainly what that is, the goal behind that. The nutrition facts label is a little different. It's meant to provide you with a little bit of a scope as to how healthy or how nutritious that food is for you. That said, it can be very, very confusing to work its way through. So you've got things at the very top, which is probably, I think, the most important number, but it's also on this label anyway. We'll talk about, so there's some changes that they're making to it, but the number is very small. It says a quarter of a cup. That's a serving size. That can be very misleading to a lot of people a lot of times, particularly with things like sodas or bags of chips. Even I've seen yogurt containers and stuff like that. They'll say that a serving size, it's contained in a package that looks like you're meant to eat the entire package, but a serving size, according to the label, is half the package. So it's something you might want to watch out for. The FDA has kind of cracked down on food companies to where they can no longer do that. Now you might see sometimes where there's kind of columns where they say, okay, a serving size, there is is 100 calories, but this whole bottle is 300 calories. So at least you can kind of see that there is a difference there between the serving size and the entire container of that food. That said, not everybody reads those, and it can be a little bit confusing. Then it has things like calories, fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates, and then sometimes they break down the carbohydrate into dietary fiber, which is one type of carbohydrate. That's a carbohydrate that our bodies don't digest, and then sugars, and then there's 1,000 other different types of carbohydrates that are just kind of not accounted for on the label. As you can see on this one, it says that there's a total sugar, but then there's also it would delineate if there had been any added sugar. This particular product, it says 0, so there's no added sugar, which is great. But if there had been added sugar, you would see that on that line. So I'm going to move ahead. This picture, I just think kind of depicts a little bit easier the differences between the new and the old nutrition facts label. So as you can see, the original label, things are kind of monotone, and it's a little difficult to kind of tell what's what. The font's very small. It's very difficult to kind of tell just at first glance. Whereas with the second one, the one on the right, it looks like they've increased the font size on a couple of things. So particularly the serving size and the calories are much larger. So it's kind of easier just at a glance to get a look at that. And then they've added in the added sugars. So any product, food companies are still in the process of changing over to this newer food label. So the FDA gave them, they gave them 2 years, and then they gave them an extension. And it just seems like a never-ending cycle of extensions. But it should be by the end of 2020 that all food labels should look like the one on the right. And like I said, you can see how many added sugars are in your products, which is something that you might want to be mindful of if you're trying to lose weight, or if you're trying to just kind of reduce the your sugar intake overall. Lots of products have natural sugar. So yogurt is a really good example. Yogurt is made from milk, which has natural sugars in it, but then a lot of yogurt products will add sugar. The food company will add a lot of sugar in, particularly if they're adding some type of fruit jelly on the bottom, and the sugar content can actually get quite high, but very little of that percentage-wise has come from the yogurt itself. So just things like that it'll make it a little easier for the consumer to be mindful of. And then this probably doesn't excite anybody other than me as a dietitian, but then the micronutrients they've listed on the original label, it was AC, and those are the two main ones, and then sometimes calcium and iron. Those are not really relevant to our population today. So when the food nutrition facts label originally came out, America was in the Great Depression, and there were actually really high incidences of vitamin C and vitamin A deficiency. Those were very common. That is no longer the case, but we are seeing increased rates of vitamin D deficiency. So now the new food labels will in fact tell you how much vitamin D is in that product. And they've also accounted for potassium, which doesn't really affect most people, but we are also seeing an increase in kidney disease. And with kidney disease, you have to be mindful of potassium intake. So that's helpful for those patients as well. For the rest of us, it doesn't really affect much. So those are the labels that are regulated. I also want to talk a little bit about organic versus conventional. So organic has to do with how the food is grown. So there are things like GMOs or non-GMOs. That has to do with the seed that is planted, but organic versus non-organic has to do with how that seed is grown. very often GMO and organic products will go hand in hand, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one doesn't automatically default to the other. So organic foods can be GMO foods, and non-GMO foods can be grown in a manner that's not organic. So that's just kind of a sticky differential right there. But so organic basically means that they're grown without fertilizers, insecticides, weed killers, hormones, anything that would affect the growing of whether that's a plant product or an animal product. I guess that's another distinction. GMOs obviously only apply to plants because you're manipulating the seed at the genetic level, whereas organic can apply to both livestock as well as plant products. And then in order to be considered organic, the USDA is actually the governing body, so that's a different government agency. So the FCA as well regulates the food, the nutrition facts label, and the ingredients. The USDA is what certifies growers as organic growers, and they basically go through. They very closely monitor farms. They check records. Typically, for an organic farm to get up and running and to be certified organic takes at least 5 to 7 years. So it really is a long process, and it's pretty rigorous in terms of the regulation that is placed upon it. So that USDA organic seal is the only seal. So you'll hear me say this several times throughout the presentation, but generally speaking, labels that are on the back of food products are typically the ones that are regulated, and those are the ones that you can believe, whereas there will be a lot of health claims or a lot of just kind of rubbish, really, that can be placed on the front of the package, and that may or may not be true. That's just basically unregulated territory. Some of it may be true, some of it may be not, but there's no governing agency that regulates, that mandates that information must be in fact factual for the company to print it on their label. So that's something to kind of be mindful of as well. USDA organic, that seal it pops up kind of everywhere, front, back, side, what have you. Same with a non-GMO seal, those kind of pop up wherever, but they are in fact regulated seals. And then I also put the Environmental Protection Agency. So anything that's grown what's considered conventionally, so it's not grown organically, the EPA still has standards for those food products. So those food products, it's not just kind of like, all right, we'll put as many pesticides as you want on it. No, that's not how it works. They make sure that there's 100 to 1,000-fold margin of safety. So what that means is that if you have, say if someone ingests 100 milligrams of a certain pesticide and that's considered to be toxic, and that's kind of the lower limit of what's considered toxic for that pesticide, then the EPA would mandate that any food product that is using that pesticide, there has to be less than 1 gram or 1 milligram rather of pesticide residue found on that product in order for it to be considered safe for sale. So they do make sure that these pesticides, they're often used very early in the growing season, and then kind of once the plants take off, there's really no need for them. But just so you all are aware as consumers, that's not to say that there aren't regulations in place for non-organically grown products. There certainly are. Moving forward, why is my screen not? Okay. So that's all of our regulated food labels. So you've got your nutrition facts and your ingredients labels. Those are regulated by the FDA. And then we've got the USDA organic seal that's regulated by the USDA. And then the EPA manages all other non-organic, and that's just the Environmental Protection Agency. They manage it from an environmental standpoint, but they also manage it from a human health standpoint as well. They manage both. Unregulated food labels, that some have definitions and some don't. It's a little fuzzy. So you'll see things like low fat or low sodium. All that means is that it's 1/3 less than the original product. So take, for example, I was looking at a box of wheat thins earlier today. So they'll say, lower sodium. That just means that they have 1/3 less sodium than the original product, which was, the full sodium original wheat thins. There's no strict definition as to how much sodium that includes. It's just going to vary based on what the original product had. The low fat does have a little bit more of a stringent definition. It means that there's less than 0.5 grams of total fat. And again, that can be something that is manipulated from, so say you've got, you know, some variety of cookies, and then you have a low fat version of those same cookies that are meant to taste the same. The low fat version would have to be less than 0.5 grams of fat. There are some foods that just don't contain much fat anyway. So sometimes the food companies will kind of try to make it look as though the food is healthier by printing low fat on there, even though it's kind of like, well, duh, there wasn't fat in that to begin with. Reduced fat is very similar to lower sodium. So again, you're basing it off of the original product. So there's no strict definition in terms of what reduced fat means. It just means that it's less, 20 to 50%, which again is a pretty big margin. But it means that it's bigger, or it's less than the original product. So what that means in terms of fat grams and what type of fat, that's just going to be based on what that original product had. Natural food companies love to print natural. They change their packaging to kind of be like these earth tones and whatnot. I think Cheetos are my favorite. They're natural Cheetos. There's nothing natural about a Cheeto, okay? There's not a natural way to make a Cheeto. That does not grow out of the ground. It does not come out of an animal. It's not natural. But there's no formal definition for the term natural on a food label, so they can get away with it. And they can tell you, okay, this product was natural, even though it is kind of anything but. And another big one is whole grain or multigrain. A lot of times that's not exactly a lie that the food companies print on there. It just means that it has more than one type of grain in it. So that means it can have wheat flour and oat flour and almond flour, or well, almond's not a grain. So wheat flour, oat flour, quinoa. It can have a variety, buckwheat, kind of different grains. But what's most important to me, and we'll go to the next slide, I think looking at the ingredients list first, if you're looking at a grain product, is actually the way to go. So whole versus refined grains, you can see that little diagram down there. The whole grain is going to have basically, so the grain is basically the seed of that plant. So a wheat plant is going to be kind of a little kernel that would serve as the seed for that plant. So that's going to have some starch in the center of it to kind of feed the seed once it gets started. It also has what's called the germ, which is kind of like a little vitamin and nutrient packed core. And then the bran, which is kind of that outer casing, if you think of like a nut or any other kind of seed. It has some vitamins and minerals. It usually has most of the fiber in the case of grains. So you kind of got a lot of nutrition packed into this little seed, because that little seed is supposed to be able to put in the ground and grow, and it kind of supports the plant growth until it's able to start, photosynthesizing and, doing plant things to support itself. Refined grains basically take all that nutrition out of it, and you're left with this white starchy flour. So that's why we as dietitians push whole grain so much, because you get so much more nutrition out of the whole grain. Now, that said, food companies will try to jazz up the nutritional value of white flour by adding B vitamins in. So the term that they like to use for that is called enriched. So very, very often, and I bet you will surprise yourself if you go down the bread aisle in the grocery store, and flip over and look at the ingredients, there'll be a lot of, again, it comes down to the front of the package versus the back of the package. So the front of the package is usually kind of whatever. There's no regulation of it. The back of the package, so that nutrition facts label and the ingredients list, that's where the food companies truly cannot lie. So even if the front of the package says whole grain whatever, if you flip it over and the first ingredient is not whole grain wheat or whole grain whatever, then that package, that food product is not in fact a whole grain food. Typically the first ingredient will be enriched wheat flour. So that's where you're getting a refined grain with some B vitamins added back in, but it's not considered a whole grain, but they can still put whole wheat or honey wheat or whatever on the front to kind of cover it up. So that's something to be mindful of as well. Another big one to look out for is sugar. So sugar will pop up in that nutrition facts label. So like we said in the very beginning, that nutrition facts label is very regulated. They are making food companies transition to a format that will tell you whether or not there's been added sugar added to that product, which makes things a lot easier. And this list essentially will kind of become obsolete. But for the time being, since there aren't a lot of food companies that have made the transition fully anyway, this can also be kind of your indicator as to whether or not the food company added sugars back in. So basically, if you look at, let's just say, for example, raisins. Raisins are, in theory, just dried grapes, right? So they're going to have natural sugar in them, which would show up on the nutrition facts label. But if you look at the ingredients, theoretically, the only ingredient on there should be raisins. Now, if you look at the package of most raisins, or really any dried fruit for that matter, that's not necessarily always the case. A lot of times you'll see raisins and cellulose and cane sugar and kind of something else added in. That's kind of your cue that sugar has been added in. So if you see any of these, and again, like, this isn't a list that anybody should ever memorize, but if you see these things on an ingredient list, that's a sugar that the food company has added in. Again, same with the yogurt example from earlier. Yogurt theoretically is just made from milk. It should be milk, and so so the ingredients should read milk and a type of bacterial culture to kind of make that milk into yogurt. But very often you'll see, again, a list of added sugars and other dyes and whatnot kind of added into it. So again, that kind of just is your clue that the food companies have added sugar in. So the sugars, to be clear, the sugars that are naturally contained in things like fruit or milk or whatnot will not appear on the ingredients list. So just the ingredients such as milk or the fruit will appear, but then if you see words from this list, you know that they've added some form of sugar in. Another question I get asked very often is if there's a difference between natural sugar and added sugar. I'm sorry, the bottom of that question got cut off there, but the question should be, is there a difference between natural sugar and added sugar? Or if there's certain sugars such as, cane sugar or turbine sugar is a really popular one. Granulated sugar as opposed to honey. People kind of like to think of sugars as like natural versus not natural. And there are natural sugars versus non-natural sugars. But as far as your body is concerned, there's no difference. That's not to say that, you should be loading up on things that are full of high fructose corn syrup. But from a metabolism standpoint, it doesn't really matter to your body. It's going to read all sugar the same. So anything on that list, your body is going to basically digest the same way, regardless of where it originally came from. So that's, again, not really related to food labels, but just kind of a point to mention. I do want to talk a little bit about supplements. So supplements are technically not considered a food, and they're not considered a medication. So even though they kind of walk the line of playing both parts, they're actually not regulated at all by the FDA. So that's kind of something that some people are very shocked to find out. So supplements are products that contain at least one dietary ingredient. So that can be something like protein, it can be specific amino acids, it can be a certain vitamins like B vitamins, vitamin C, stuff like that. Any of those types of things that contain one dietary ingredient, and then the other regulation, or the other stipulation rather, is that they have to be swallowed. That doesn't really apply. That doesn't really exclude a whole lot. The only exception would be something like a sublingual tablet or a sublingual like thing that dissolves on your tongue. That those are really just kind of off on their own little tangent. They do have to contain a supplement facts label that consists of what the dietary ingredient is, and then an RDA, which is the recommended daily allowance. So that's what. So for most dietary ingredients, there has been research to show kind of an ideal amount that we want people to consume. And that's an ideal amount in terms of sufficiency. So, for example, we've determined that, 100 milligrams of vitamin D every day is sufficient to maintain good health in 95.5% of the population, is technically what it means. There are some dietary ingredients, particularly when you get into kind of Chinese herbs and stuff like that, that the RDA has not been established. So if there's no RDA, obviously the supplement company does not have to report that, but they do have to report what dietary ingredients are included in that supplement. And again, that's so that if somebody is allergic to a particular dietary ingredient, that they are aware of what they're consuming. That said, there is no governing body that requires them to accurately report health claims. A lot of supplement companies will, in fact, conduct their own clinical trials. So when a medication is coming to market, that drug company has to provide, evidence on evidence on evidence that the drug is both safe for human consumption, and then also that it's effective. So very often, if it's something that, for example, a cancer drug, they have to prove that it's either as effective or more effective than the current standard treatment. So if the standard treatment is chemotherapy, they have to prove that their drug is as effective, if not more effective, than the current recommended chemotherapy regimen. And that, of course, that it's safe for human consumption. Supplement companies don't necessarily have to do that by law. A lot of them do, and a lot of them try to, just so that they can kind of put on their product, okay, we've done the clinical trials, this is what we found. But the caveat with that is that they very often do that on a very small magnitude. So when pharmaceutical companies are doing clinical trials, they sink, and this is not an arbitrary number, they do sink, in fact, billions of dollars into the clinical trial alone, not to mention all of the research and development that went behind the drug before it was even a drug. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind. It's a $1 billion industry, and we can get into the debate of whether or not drugs should be so expensive. But the fact of the matter is they're doing a huge scale clinical trial because you don't want to go then and put a product on the market that is not safe for the general population. And as we've all seen with those TV commercials of the lawyers are like, oh, have you taken such and such and experienced these symptoms? Call us. It still happens, right? So even with those huge, large scale clinical trials, they still run the risk then that when you go and put it in the true general population, there's no way to account for, well, there's going to be somebody somewhere likely that's going to have a problem with it. And sometimes it's an entire subset of people that they just didn't account for in their clinical trials. And it gets into a whole logistical nightmare. But the fact of the matter is supplement companies don't even come close, right? So they're not going anywhere near the power that's behind the clinical trials that the drug companies are doing. The drug companies are partially doing those clinical trials because they're required to by law. The supplement companies aren't required to, so they may do a study in 50 or 100 people and kind of call it a day. But that's not really, that's not clinical evidence in the true definition of the word. The other caveat, the way supplements are able to get around the legality of having to produce more powerful clinical trials is that they contain dietary ingredients. So the rationale is that if you're providing a dietary ingredient that somebody can consume in food anyway, then it's generally regarded as safe. And the reason why they have to place the RDA on there is because there is an upper limit for most dietary ingredients. Kind of the most tangible one is vitamin C. So the upper limit of vitamin C before you start to see side effects, usually for most people, is 2 grams a day, but some of the supplements have upwards of 1,000 milligrams or a gram a day. So that's, you're halfway there with one dose. So that's just kind of something people are mindful of as well, that because it's a dietary ingredient and they're informing you of how much is recommended, what percentage of that is contained in this product, people theoretically can make their own informed decisions as to whether or not they want to consume that much of that particular product. But that's why they're generally regarded as safe. Another thing, I'm not sure if I have it on another slide. I don't, so I'm going to go back. Just another thing to be mindful of is that the supplement companies are required to report the dietary ingredient and the RDA if it exists, but they are not required to report any other ingredients such as dyes or gels or gums or kind of anything that makes it possible for that dietary ingredient to be in a pill form. They're not necessarily required to report that, whereas the FDA does require that food and drugs companies are required to report that information. So that's something to be mindful of as well. Most supplement companies do report that anyway, just to avoid a lawsuit, but they aren't required to by law. So anyway, so step off my soapbox for that. But as you can see, this kind of follows our trend of, believe the stuff on the back of the package, take the stuff on the front of the package with a grain of salt. So I've got 2 examples here, and I know the one on the bottom is a little bit small, maybe difficult to read. I just wanted you to kind of see the supplement facts label and see what it looks like and what information is reported there. As you can see, they've got, all of the branched chain amino acids on there, how many milligrams. There's not a percent of the daily. So basically, what that little star means on the side is that there's not a daily value established, basically. So they can't determine what the percentage of the daily value would be. The same goes for the one on the bottom. But the one on the bottom and really the one on the top, so, the information contained in those supplement facts labels, that has to be factual. But the stuff on the front, so, things like supports muscle building, speeds recovery, those aren't necessarily facts. The drug company, the supplement company, again, may have done their own clinical research to draw those conclusions, or they might just put it on a package. You really have no way of knowing. So again, just kind of take those things with a grain of salt. Just a little bit about the clinical research behind some sports supplements. So again, I mentioned my primary background is in weight loss, but then I've also kind of branched into the world of sports dietetics as well. So products that have actually had a substantial amount of research behind them are caffeine, beetroot juice, and creatine. There actually is a strong body of evidence, just because these things have been around for so long. The supplement companies have only studied them in marginal amounts, but lots of researchers and trainers I'm sorry, something's popping up on my thing. So lots of researchers, trainers, all kinds of folks sports dietitians have researched these things kind of on their own accord as a ways to make recommendations to their clients. So caffeine, beetroot juice, actually there is strong evidence to support that they enhance performance if they're taken before a workout. Branched chain amino acids are kind of newer to the landscape, and there's actually not really any evidence that they improve performance at all. I have yet to see a single study that supports branched chain amino acid use as a performance enhancer. Whey protein actually does have, so whey is a protein that's contained in milk. It's most protein shakes that are kind of generic protein shakes that are on the market are going to have some combination. Sometimes it's whey and something else, but usually it's primarily a whey product. Those definitely help improve muscle recovery. They also help to build muscle mass when combined with resistance training. So that's kind of a big caveat as well. If you're just drinking a protein shake and you're not working out, your body's just going to turn those excess calories to fat the same way it would anything else. But if you're drinking your protein shake in addition to doing resistance training or weightlifting, there is a strong body of evidence that actually can increase your muscle mass and improve performance as well. Because milk products are kind of, I don't want to say on the downtrend, but a lot of people now are trying to kind of avoid traditional dairy products for a variety of reasons, but there have been this upsurge of either vegan or vegetarian protein products available on the market. So as I mentioned, whey protein is far and away the best studied because it's been around the longest, but if people are trying to avoid dairy, whey is a protein found in milk. So pea protein is kind of the standard vegetarian option, and it's less effective than whey. We definitely know that for sure, but we don't know how much less effective or why that might be. There's just kind of not enough evidence yet to really make that call. That said, it still is helpful. So if you're really opposed to drinking a milk-based supplement, that's perfectly fine. Pea protein is a good alternative. Just kind of be aware that the evidence is not as strong. If you are somebody who's really working to increase muscle mass and you have no problem drinking a milk protein, then whey would probably be the way to go. Wrapping up on supplements, I think as a dietitian, what supplements to me are just everything is contained in the name itself, right? It should supplement a healthy diet. So there are a variety of reasons why some people just are not able to eat certain types of foods. The one that kind of comes to mind most readily to me is celiac disease. So people with celiac disease have to avoid gluten at all costs, and that's just because their body simply cannot tolerate it. Another example would be somebody who's lactose intolerant, can't tolerate dairy products. And beyond allergies, there's certain reasons why people either have higher nutritional needs or just simply can't get nutrition from certain products. So that said, there are supplements out there to kind of help bridge the gap. So as a general rule, I always recommend that people try to get the majority of their nutrition from whole foods. Now, whole foods is another term that's kind of tricky. So whole foods just kind of mean foods that are largely untainted, right? So things like fruits and vegetables, that doesn't mean that, like it doesn't have to be raw, but things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, protein sources, the variety of protein sources are pretty untainted as well. But research has actually shown that you burn 50% more calories if you're digesting your food from a whole food source versus a processed food source. So that can go back to something like a whole grain versus a refined grain, a real cheese as opposed to a processed cheese, stuff like that. Your body actually has to work harder because you're basically extracting the nutrients out of that food. And when you process food, the food company basically doesn't have that process for you. So you don't actually burn as many calories in the process of eating it. And then, like I said earlier, supplements are a great tool for people who can't eat certain food groups or can't eat certain food. Even some people, for example, if you've recently had surgery or someone with cancer, or there's a whole host of clinical conditions that make you actually need more calories, or just more of certain types of foods. And it can be tough sometimes to get that much of those things from your diet alone, particularly in someone who maybe is a cancer patient and just isn't feeling well or doesn't have an appetite or is feeling nauseated, stuff like that. There's lots of things we can do supplement wise to help provide the patient the nutrition they need, but not, force them to eat, 7,000 calories a day or something like that. So again, it's just something to be mindful of. Supplements, in my opinion, should be just that. You should not be getting the majority of your nutrition from supplements. It should be kind of a balance and a fill in for those times or certain people who are not able to get nutrition from certain sources. So just to wrap up, so I think, I kind of threw a lot of information at you, and a lot of it was very regulatory, and some of it might have even been a little bit dry. And I apologize for that, but, I feel like the question most people have at this point in time is just kind of, okay, well, you kind of told me all of these things, but like, how do I get to where I want to go, right? Like, how do I take this information and use it to get the results I want, whatever those may be. My general rule of thumb, and anybody who's coached with me knows this for sure, you can't out-train a bad diet. You just can't. And that goes for a supplement standpoint or a training standpoint. You really need that healthy, balanced nutrition. And that's going to look a little different for everybody, which is why coaching one-on-one is so important. Everybody's body is a little different. Everybody's activity level is a little different. Everybody's food preferences are a little different. And, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? So there's a lot of different ways for you to meet your individual needs that work within your personal preferences. There's no one set way to live a healthy life or to eat a healthy diet. It's going to look different for everybody. And that's really where coaching one-on-one comes in, and why it's so, so important to work with somebody who really understands you and your needs, is going to give you that individualized attention, because there's just not prescriptive advice that we can give nutritionally that's going to apply to everyone in every situation. That said, if you are somebody who is trying to build muscle, as I said a little bit earlier with the supplements, but resistance training is also a very important key to that. And I would argue that it's also equally as important in weight loss as well. Building and maintaining that muscle mass, whether that's your only goal or if you're trying to maintain your muscle mass while you're losing weight, resistance training is going to be very important. So I just told you how you can't out-train a bad diet, and you can't, but you also need to train in order to reach your goals as well. And then if you're an endurance athlete or somebody who's kind of spending a lot of time doing cardio, the best way to fuel for that is carbohydrates before, during, and after. And again, if you're somebody who is training for an endurance event, come talk to me. I'm happy to give you more details on what that looks like. But I just wanted to kind of put it out there that if you're somebody who is, spending long hours training, you kind of have to fuel before, during, and after. It's not just kind of a before and an after thing. A lot of times that during the workout fuel is really important as well. So just to wrap up quickly, and then I'll give you guys the floor to ask any questions that you might have. So, nutrition facts, supplement facts, and ingredient labels are regulated by the FDA. And like I said several times throughout the presentation, but I'll kind of reiterate it here, those are the things on the back of the package. Those are the kind of the things, the take home is that anything that is on the back of the package, generally speaking, is regulated in some capacity, and it's typically believable, whether that's the ingredient or some type of fact label. Those are the things that are regulated. Also, organic products are regulated. They're not regulated by the FDA, but they're regulated by the USDA, which is an equally, if not more stringent government body. And then things like health facts, nutritional benefits, health claims, kind of those front of package labels, those are generally not regulated. And the example I love to give people is just kind of the natural Cheeto. Again, nothing natural about a Cheeto at all. I don't care what kind of natural cheese dust they claim that it's made with. It's not natural. So that's kind of all I had for everyone. This is just kind of my wrap-up slide of don't eat less, eat right. So, you know, whether that means you're somebody who's trying to lose weight or cut certain things out of your diet, I don't want you to eat less food. I just want you to eat more of the right food. And most people kind of like that mentality a little bit better than just cut sugar out of your diet, because that's no fun. So with that, I will wrap up, and I'm going to kind of end my screen sharing here so that I can see any comments that you all have. Like I said in the very beginning, you all are welcome to comment with audio, but there's also a place to type. I know sometimes like iPhones and stuff like that don't quite jive with the audio on here. So you can also type any questions in that little chat box that's kind of there on the bottom. So I'll let you guys think of any questions that you have. Otherwise, it has been my pleasure. And if there's any slides that you want me to go back to because you kind of missed something or something wasn't clear, by all means, I'll just kind of shrink this down and then let me know. Okay, well, it looks like everybody kind of jetted off. So that being the case, I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful rest of your Sunday afternoon, or I guess we're into evening now. But I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Hope you have a wonderful week ahead. I am just now noticing how grainy that picture is. I'm sorry. But I will see you next week. And I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend and a great week. I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.